You're listening to Deconstructive Criticism, and today I'm talking to Jan Macvarish. Jan is an English sociologist and critical to the metoo-campaign. She was flown into Stockholm this Saturday to participate in a metoo-debate at the Battle of Ideas Stockholm. Apparently, the organizers couldn't find a single critical person of metoo in all of Sweden, so they were forced to import Jan from the UK. And through a mutual friend, I managed to get an interview with her right after she had come down from stage. I'm recording this in the fall of 2017, while almost everyone in Sweden is cowering in fear from the Twitter storm raging just outside their screens in cyberspace. Sweden has been more blessed or cursed, depending on your point of view, by the Me Too phenomenon than any other country on earth. If you don't believe me, please look in the description below this episode on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the description below this episode, regardless what platform you're listening on. Please, take the time, I urge you, because I fear my description will not do it justice. There you will see a Google Trends map of the entire world, mapping out country by country the Google statistic for the search term Me Too. Countries range in color from gray to different shades of blue according to how much the search term is used. Sweden is Yves Klein blue. When I'm first shown this picture, Sweden has the value 100. Numbers represent search interest relative to the highest point on the chart for the given region and time. A value of 100 is the peak popularity for the term. A value of 50 means that the term is half as popular. Likewise, a score of 0 means the term was less than 1% as popular as the peak. So Sweden is given a value of 100, and in a distant second place looms the Netherlands with only 38 points. A drab blue so boring it's hard to look at. 2 days later, Sweden is still at 100, and now Norway has taken second place with a score of only 17. Norway is approaching grey, while we are still the color of a very healthy smurf, proving that Sweden is uniquely affected by the Me Too phenomenon. It is astounding and a bit embarrassing. In Denmark, they just laugh at us Swedes. They call what is going on here svenskerier, Swedishness. If it sounds a bit like craziness, it's supposed to. That's the point. So how come the most feminist country in the world at the same time have the most rapes and sexual harassment? After all, we have a feminist government, according to itself the first feminist government ever, and we have a feminist foreign policy, and we gave women the vote before any other country. How can a country that has included gender perspective in school from kindergarten to university and beyond be the most misogynistic? The usual argument for this is, the fact that Sweden is the most progressive country in the world might make us a bit more open to talk about things like this, and that we, because of this, have a higher reported rate than most other countries who naturally are equally bad or most probably worse. And sure, that could explain some of the phenomenon. But over 650 Swedish singers signed a Me Too petition. Over 450 actresses. When the actresses gathered for a large manifestation at a city-run theater in Stockholm, members of the royal family was there. As the actresses read confessions of harassment and abuse they had been subjected to in their workplace. It was televised and held in English for the whole world to see. I really hope you watched it. Over 4,500 female lawyers, which sounds like quite a lot, but I checked the numbers, and apparently SACO, an organization for lawyers, says there are only 35,000 people working in the sector today. Half of that would be females, and that's 17,500. 4,500 out of 17,500 is only about 25.7%, so maybe we should ask why 74.3% of female lawyers didn't sign the petition. Or roughly 75% of female lawyers pro-rape and sexual harassment. And now more than 4,000 journalists have signed their own Me Too petition. At public service, that's what we Swedes call our state-owned television and radio channels, the journalists' clubs in all branches are calling to workshops where their petition will be read every half hour. The invitation reads, "Come, read, think, and battle sexism and different forms of harassment with us. Individuals of all genders are welcome. We that arrange this are the club chairmen of SVT, UR, and SR. That's the different branches of TV, educational programming, and radio. And then it goes on, and we would very much want to form a task force to continue to work on these questions. Since the 14th of November, the unions are involved, promising to battle sexual harassment business sector by business sector. Apparently, 60% of the young female workers in the industrial sector have been sexually harassed. At least according to the Metal Workers Union chairperson, Marie Nilsson. That's an astoundingly high figure, 60%, especially to happen on a female boss's watch, one could note. On the 16th of November, the state prosecutor officially recognized the importance of the MeToo campaign for the justice system itself, thus suspending habeas corpus, which among other things would guarantee you the right to know what you are accused of and who your accuser is, a fundamental principle in most Western justice systems. Rather new to Sweden, I admit, though it has been made into Swedish law by the European Convention of Human Rights. In Sweden, it was made into law 1994:1219. As if anyone cares. Now, it's null and void. And sure, there are a few voices that are concerned that this might be creating an informer society, a society where anyone can accuse anyone else of being a rapist or a deviant, where lynch justice rules the land. Reactionaries who don't understand that the moment is finally here. The perfectly equal and just society is just around the corner. All it needs is this little, final push. We're doing it to get rid of sexual predators after all. And if that costs a few wrongful accusations, a few people who get fired to never find work again, a few more innocent lives ruined in the process, then so be it. Utopia will have been worth it. But it still doesn't answer the question why Sweden, the most feminist country in the world, is at the same time the country most plagued by hatred against women. I mean, we have done everything right. We have been applying gender science in schools, modulating female behavior to be more like boys, to break the norms, and boys to be, well, less like boys for 30 years now. And sure, the boys' grades are lower than ever. They even suck at math and physics now, but the girls are fucking awesome, so it's not like we haven't sacrificed for feminism. We have gender certified the military, the police department, medicine. Don't ask me how, but apparently biology finally came around to the Swedish way of looking at it. And why is it first and foremost women in media and entertainment and law, powerful women with high education, part of our elites, that seem to have the worst problems? These people, after all, belong to the most privileged group of people that ever lived. And why now? Sweden has, after all, had a real rape epidemic for years now. Not talked about, not demonstrated against, no hashtags or task forces or group hugs. For decades, women in the suburbs have been complaining of moral police roaming the streets to make sure they cover up and behave like proper women. When a woman in a wheelchair was raped by migrants in a toilet stall in Gotland and the locals started protesting for justice, the media, the entertainment industry, and the justice system called them a lynch mob and racist. And maybe they were. But what, in that case, is the difference? I think that it is precisely because of this that we are in our current situation. But I will continue after the talk with Jan, so please continue to listen after our conversation, and I will tell you more about the specific situation in Sweden. Now, Jan Macvarish. Enjoy. So, we're at Kulturhuset Stockholm. It's the 18th of November 2017, according to the Gregorian calendar, and I'm sitting with Jan Macvarish. Yes, and you're really an author, and you've written a book on neuroparenting, and I haven't really read it. So could you just please tell me briefly what it was about?
Well, I'm a sociologist who's looked at interpersonal relationships, intimacy, and particularly parenting and parenting culture. So the book was an exploration of how claims about babies' brains have entered into policy in the UK and in the US as well, actually. So the argument is being increasingly made in policy that we now know how children ought to be raised on the basis of new science about the brain. So the kind of truths emerging from neuroscience, which kind of present us with an absolute, uncontestable version of what parenting ought to be like.
But it's not like they have a coherent system, they just have random facts.
They are, yes, because it's not really something that's put forward by scientists themselves. It's an appropriation of science, so what's been called scientism, which is being used by advocacy groups, by particular NGOs, by people who would like to receive state funding for implementing particular programs, in particular this idea of early intervention, which is that social welfare or social interventions or programs of social support needs to start very, very early in life, preferably pre-birth, so possibly during pregnancy, so that mothers need to be informed and provided with support to nurture the fetus in particular ways, but also in order to create functioning infant brains.
That sounds like some sort of horrible dystopian Aldous Huxley type future, and Sweden today.
Yes, well, it's there's lots of people have made parallels with eugenics, which I know Swedes really liked, but it's slightly different. It is rather like eugenics in the sense that there's a very strong prevention agenda to the whole thing. But I think it's much less coherent than eugenics. Eugenics was really, in the UK and elsewhere in the US, it was really a consensus view of the way human beings were made and how society could be improved. Although the UK didn't go as far as other places, or the US or Germany or Sweden, in terms of actually implementing policies on the basis of eugenic thinking. But what we have now with what I've called neuroparenting, which is the idea that we have these new truths about how family life ought to be lived, is that there's much less direct authoritarian intervention to sort of weed out people who are unfit, but there are very strong prescriptions as to what parents ought to do. And what this tends to translate into is the idea that mothers in particular need to be extremely attentive to their infants at all times, including in utero. So
sounds like they're trying to make everyone into a Jewish mother.
Well, I think probably even Jewish mothers probably worry less than probably contemporary British or American mothers about every aspect of their child's development. But yes, there's an element of that, this kind of cultivation of very, very close attentive behaviour on the part of mothers, but also fathers as well are now included in this kind of discourse. And what's talked about is the need for parental attunement. So for the parent to cultivate an attached relationship with the baby, which is said to be necessary for brain development, the parent needs to be extremely attuned to the baby's emotional states. And if they're not, if they're out of step with those and fail to respond quickly enough, then it's not just that the child will be unhappy in the moment, it's that there will be future damage caused to the child's brain, which will inhibit their development in the longer term.
This is some new form of biological moralism, then?
Yes.
Could you say that?
Yes.
Yes, because I only read a review about it online before I got here. And I came to Kulturhuset because you were just in a Me Too debate. And I missed it, unfortunately, because I was doing another interview. But how come you're invited to a debate about the Me Too phenomenon when you're writing about neuroparenting?
Well, I've spoken over the years and written about interpersonal relationships and intimacy. My PhD was looking at single women and the kind of growing phenomenon of people living by themselves. So I've always been really interested in what are the barriers to us actually achieving satisfactory or happy relationships with one another, including raising children. So I've always been interested in that, and that's something that I've spoken about and written about over the years. And this debate, I think, it does relate to the parenting question, because there is it's part of a broader culture which is continually demanding mediation within very, very intimate relationships. I mean, there's nothing more intimate than a mother's relationship with a newborn baby.
Yes.
But the demand is made that that's a dangerous space. And that space needs to be eliminated, the risks need to be eliminated from it by the intervention of experts or science. And the equivalent in Me Too, which actually came up in the debate today, is the demand that we need to train children how to handle relationships. They need consent training. We need better sex education. And the argument was put forward by some people that we need to teach young people how to police their own boundaries. And I think that's something very similar to what's going on in the neuroparenting discussion, which is this idea that spontaneous human relationships, which are not guided and formed by expert opinion of what is right, what is the correct way to do things, are just too risky to be left by themselves. So I think there's a whole load of parallels across there.
So let's say that the liberation of sex started with Freud. And before Freud, both men and women were sexually repressed and oppressed, right? And then you start a liberalization, and this opens up a gray area where the church or the family doesn't decide your sexuality anymore. but that also puts a lot of responsibility on the individuals, right? So both man and woman has to take responsibility for the act of courtship, right? Individual responsibility, not according to societal norms, but find their own way.
Yeah.
Yes. And at the same time, they're being reared in a way that takes away their own responsibility and makes them believe that they need mediation or help from the state or the mother in every instance. Does this in some way sum up your argument?
Well, I think there is, yes. I think there's something there, which is the idea of total freedom is a very frightening state to be in, and it can feel like a huge amount of pressure, especially when there is a sort of vacating of the space of moral or social norms, especially ones that would have been religious. So one of the things that came up in the debate today, which is really interesting, and a point I wanted to try to pursue, which is that this, for me, there's great parallels between religious fundamentalism, which says that men and women they just cannot be together. It's just too risky, or that sex is something that God gives to us, and we must, act on it according to God's will and restrain ourselves. The feminist version of that, I would say, and the one that's become very prevalent, is the idea that sex is women's gift, and it's something that they give to men. And they don't really want it in the first place, but they have it. And that men want it all the time, and that somehow women are these kind of non-sexual creatures who possess sex, and that they must it's a terrible responsibility for them to try to continually sort of rebuff men. And that's what comes through really strongly in this debate and in previous debates, which is a real kind of deep fear of heterosexuality, I think.
A fear of heterosexuality?
Yes. I think there's a real fear of...
Because, so let's start from the beginning. What happened in this debate? Because you've just flown in from England, right, to participate in this.
Yeah.
And so what was it like for you? Please tell me.
Well, I'd heard that Sweden had gone a lot further with the Me Too discussion than maybe even Britain. I'm not quite sure that's true, actually. I think in Britain it's taken a very particular form where there's been a kind of political crisis that's formed around Me Too. And obviously everybody's been interested in the Hollywood version of Me Too. And I'm sure in each national context it takes a very particular form. What came up in the debate today, though, which is something which is fairly universal, which is that the claims of people who see themselves as victims are very difficult to challenge in public discourse. And so I was on a panel with Cissi Wallins,
Cissi Wallin, yeah.
Cissi Wallin, who's very well known here as far as I understand it, and was...
She certainly is.
Okay, I didn't know. So, but I'd read a bit about her beforehand, who spoke as a survivor, as she called herself, of a, what sounds a dreadful thing if it happened, of being drugged and raped, and it then failing to have police action, which is a big problem and would need to be investigated. But she also said that she didn't like the fact that the Me Too movement had been denigrated as being a witch hunt, because she said, I am a witch and I am on the hunt. Now, I suggested that's the complete misunderstanding of what a witch hunt is, which is what witch hunts was that it was other people defining who the witches were, and the witches that were hunted. So I think there's an idea of this sort of, a legitimization of vengeance for this idea that there's somehow this war going on. And she actually spoke about a war on women.
Yes.
And I think this is such a curious worldview, because if men are at war with women, then how can we sit in a room with them and have a debate, which we just did? So I think there's a huge amount of hyperbole, exaggeration, and disingenuousness in the way this discussion is played out. And
but this is how you perceived the situation when you came in. This is you in the panel after half an hour, or? Well,
this was the initial comments that were made, and then Marta, whose surname you'll have to fill in for me, who's from Norway, who has a problem. She thinks that the Me Too campaign is a high point of radical feminism, she said, or revolutionary feminism. She thinks it's absolutely fantastic, but has reservations about the naming of men without there being some kind of legal process. And so she, unlike Cissi, she does think that there's a need for some kind of restraint in that respect. But nevertheless, she thinks it's something very positive. But she also raised concerns about it there being an element of public cleansing going on, which was really interesting because she spoke before me, and cleansing was exactly the word that I was going to use. And so what comes through very strongly, I think, from the other speakers, including the man who spoke, whose name was Jonathan Rollins, who's an American comedian but lives in Sweden, he spoke about his own awakening. That's the word he used, and that all men have had the experience of going too far on a first date, and that he was then awoken to his own behaviour. I'm not quite sure by what, which led him to then try to act differently, so that he wasn't part of what he called rape culture. And he then, at the end, spoke about trying to raise his son so that he did not also contribute to rape culture. And and that we need sex education to help us police the boundaries and to understand that no means no. And so what comes through from the panel is this really very fundamentalist view of sexual relationships being this dreadful, toxic space where terrible things happen and people are destroyed. But it's spoken about in sort of light terms, because if it's really the case, there should be direct action now on the street, and we shouldn't be sitting in a room together.
Well,
and
you're describing it very interestingly, because I consider this to be part of the state religion in Sweden, the secular state religion that took Christianity's place after they exterminated Christianity here between let's just say 1945 and 1978 for some reason. And then, so they do really believe, and this has been government policy as well, throughout all levels of education, from kindergarten to university, and in every government department. It's the gender science, because it's a science here in Sweden. It's not gender studies as it is in England. It's gender science. It's in our army instructions for soldiers, police. Medical care.
And what's the belief here what's the primary
belief?
Well,
the basic belief is that, there's no biological difference between men and women, but men are biologically inherently toxic and women are biologically inherently good.
Yeah.
They are constantly victims, and the men are always the perpetrators. And this is, basically state law now.
Well, I thought it was, I tried to counter what I knew was probably going to be the way the argument would go, which was with personal anecdotes. And I know that Sissy is there because of her personal anecdotes. And I weighed up, should I also take that approach? Because what's happened since Harvey Weinstein and the last month or so is that I think every woman probably has reflected on things that they'd actually forgotten about, and then thought, how do I interpret that? And I came up just quite quickly with 5 incidents since I was 17. And I thought, I wonder if I can actually challenge metoo by saying you can interpret all of these things in a completely different way. And the consequences of interpreting them differently is that you have to act differently, and that you create a different version of womanhood and human relationships through that. So one of the examples I started with was that when I was 17, a friend of mine was raped and murdered. Now, the man who did that was arrested, found, arrested, tried, served his time in prison. I think he may well be released now. Now, that to me is unequivocally a crime. It was treated in the way that it ought to have been, but it tells us nothing, as far as I'm concerned, about masculinity. If I want to understand why he did that, there's no point me trying to consider the attributes of all men.
You're looking at your father or your brother or your son.
Well, this man is an aberration to social rules. He's not acting in accordance with social rules.
No.
Whereas the rape culture idea suggests that somehow he's acting in accordance with something that everybody just thinks is fine.
Yes.
It's obviously not true, and we can all agree that rape and murder is a very, very bad thing.
No, we cannot all agree. You're in Sweden now.
Well, everybody did seem to agree that what happened to him was the right thing. But then moving to more ambiguous. I wanted to add something to the first one, which I'd forgotten about, which was that my final point about the first case, which was a very rape and murder, nothing more serious than that, dealt with by the law. But I also would want the man who was arrested to be presumed innocent, and that he should only be convicted if there's evidence to do so. So I think there's something really important for us all to hopefully agree on and to uphold there, that accusation is not enough. The second example was one where when I was about 21, as a student in a park with 2 friends, and we heard a whistle, and we turned around and saw a man masturbating in the bushes. And we thought, what do we do? And I said, why don't we chase him? And we chased him out of the park. And as we chased him, we realised that he was mentally handicapped. So which completely transformed the situation. And so my argument from that is that Me Too is useless in that scenario, because Me Too would say, I froze.
Yes.
I do nothing. I'm too terrified. What I'll do is I'll tweet about it afterwards.
You're incapable as an individual to take action.
Yeah. And actually I was with 2 other women. If I was by myself, I might not, but I probably would still have shouted and sworn and probably chased. Not because I'm a superhero, but just because that always seems to me that is an option. You cannot start from, you have to make a judgment, and maybe sometimes it's not safe to do that, but you're having to make a judgment very quickly in that scenario. And there is no need to assume that the only option is passivity. When we realised that he was mentally handicapped, the responsibility was then on us to decide how we act, what we did next. Do we go to the police so that he doesn't do that to a little girl? Because we are women, we're not children, we can take that responsibility. Do we act so that he doesn't get beaten up by other men because they discover him doing that to a little girl? Do we report him to the police that his parents, so I'm assuming he lived with, could get some help to try to restrain his behaviour, because he needed to restrain his behaviour? And so my argument is that, when we always have scope for action, and sometimes we can decide to not act and do something later, but we have to assume that there are choices to be made in those scenarios, and that when you act, you transform the meaning of the situation. So it's very evident by the end of it that we certainly weren't victims. We laughed about it with our male and female friends, but also were concerned.
Ridiculing the mentally handicapped.
No, we laughed about the kind of scenario, but also were concerned that this guy what would happen to him, because he isn't positioned as the terrifying bogeyman male exercising.
And at no point you and your friends thought of just taking out your cellular phone, taking a snapshot of him.
Not in 1992, no.
All right. Okay. So you didn't have that option.
No, but I think that is a bad option, actually. And I think that I think that isn't really acting to me. That's sort of what you're doing, acquiring evidence. If I'd done that, I wouldn't have seen who he was. It's only when we chased him that we realised we got closer to him, and he outran us out of the park, and we didn't pursue him, to then beat him up or anything. But we realised in the way he was running and the way he looked that there was a problem with him. And so it just transforms the situation. And when you act, that's what happens. Third example, when I moved to London, this makes it sound like it was all hell, and it really wasn't. So I had to, these scenarios came back to me. I worked in order to live in London, I worked as a carer for a guy who was paraplegic. And I used to have to push his wheelchair. And one night I was pushing him home, and a guy ran up, I assume it's a guy, ran up behind me, grabbed my backside, and then ran off. And it didn't bother me particularly. It made me shriek. But then the problem of the situation was not for me, but was for the guy I was pushing, because he was so humiliated by the fact that he could do nothing. And he was devastated by the idea that a young woman, much younger than him, would have to push him around in a wheelchair, besides all the things I had to do in terms of personal care, which was already humiliating for him. But not only that, when something happened to me, he was just passive, and there was nothing he could do. And he felt dreadful. And so my job, as far as
He's part of the patriarchy, obviously.
Well, as far as I could see it, my role was then to reassure him that it was not a problem for me, and that actually he didn't need to be humiliated either. It was okay. And actually, as I said on the panel, there was a slight thought, which people didn't like me saying this, that, oh God, I'm doing this really unglamorous job, which involves doing all kinds of hideous personal care roles, and pushing a very heavy man in a wheelchair along the uneven streets of London. But maybe at least my arse is still appealing when I'm doing it.
Right. So,
and that was a tiny thought, but the reaction on the panel was like, oh my God.
So basically, you disarmed that situation, which could have turned into a lifelong trauma for you.
Well, do you know what I actually did?
By taking it as a compliment.
No, because that wasn't everything about it. As I also, next time I pushed the wheelchair, I tied a jumper around my waist to cover up my backside, which I think is a reasonable response to that. Because, I was walking the same route, and I just thought, well, I don't really want it to happen again.
And obviously people can't keep their hands off it.
Because it's so great. It was so fantastic. No, but it is never one thing. That's my point. It's one of many things. One thing is, yes, this guy was a jerk who did that to somebody who was pushing a wheelchair. I mean, what an absolute shit to do that to somebody. He could see I was pushing a wheelchair. That's horrible. It's pathetic. But also there was a slight element of it being slightly flattering. But then the other context is that the man I was pushing found it really quite troubling. So that's none of these scenarios can be simplified. And the problem with the Me Too agenda is that it just wants to simplify all the time. Fourth example, the same guy who I pushed in a wheelchair then asked me to, this might suggest that I'm so desirable, these examples. He then asked me, he said he would pay me money if I took my top off. Difficult. I'm living in this guy's home sort of 2 nights a week and having to do very personal things for him, albeit he has only 3 functioning limbs. No, 1 functioning limb, 3 that didn't work. So, not physically threatening in that sense. But it was awkward. But then, and I said no, and then he asked again, and I said no, and a few weeks later he asked again. And at some points, I had no money, and I actually considered it. And I thought, Christmas is coming up. Maybe I could buy Christmas presents for my family. But of course, I made the decision. Well, I say, of course, I could have decided to take the money and do it, but I didn't, because I thought, well, that's going to cause a whole load of trouble. It's not who I am. I wouldn't do that. And also, it would be exploitative of him as much as it would be of me. It was a kind of mutually exploitative, degrading situation. And I didn't really want to go and give presents to my parents, which had been funded by a man who gave me money for burying my tits. So I didn't do it. But I carried on doing the job. And had I reported him, which Me Too would say I ought to do, he would have lost his home because it was provided by a charity which employed me to care for him. I would have probably lost my home because I was provided with a flat somewhere else to care for him, and he would no longer have had carers to enable him to do this independent living, which is what he was trying to do. There's no way I would have reported him and it wasn't because I was frightened. It was because I just could weigh up all the really complicated consequences of his actions and my actions, and because we were in a relationship of some sort there, he wasn't my direct employer. It was, lots of kind of complexities to it. You have to take responsibility. And so I think that, and what Me Too says is that we take no responsibility because we're women. We shouldn't have to. We shouldn't have to tie a jumper around our backside. We shouldn't have to take any responsibility for a man losing his home and losing his carers, because it's just so wicked what these people have done. And I wanted to introduce into the discussion all the other alternative interpretations and actions that are possible. And then the final example I gave, which was that at about the same time, I'd not long moved to London, and I was walking home one evening, and I was surrounded by 15 girls who took my bag from me. They didn't say anything. They just said, "Give me your bag." But I think they may not even have said that. They just took it, I think. And I just gave it to them. I just had to make a decision. So Me Too would have nothing to say about that because they're girls. They were black girls, so they would have probably even less to say, unless they may try and say that these girls were somehow influenced by
socioeconomic factors made them do
no,
it.
they might say that, but they might equally say that they're kind of taking on the norms of masculinity, which is what some people were arguing back then, which was in the late, when was that? Probably early 90s as well. And what I concluded was that, oh God, that was really humiliating. Should I have fought back? But then I instinctively thought they could actually kick my head in and it could end up really serious because there were so many of them. But I was also really pleased that in my bag was nothing other than a book by Lenin and a book by Trotsky.
Why, may I ask?
Worth about £4, and it was a second-hand briefcase. I was wearing a fur coat at the time, which I didn't wear again because I thought, well, maybe that's inviting trouble. It was from a thrift shop. But in my pockets, I had my keys in one pocket and my purse in another. So actually the consequences, that's called being street smart. So,
well, yes, but also it's kind of weird that you carry around only a book of Lenin and one book of Trotsky in your handbag. It's like you want to be robbed by the less fortunate, so you can educate them about the evils of class society.
I'm pretty sure they discarded the bag and the contents very soon afterwards. But I try to use those examples to not to sort of, share the anecdote sharing, because I then also said, of course, you don't have to believe me. And of course, that's absolutely counter to Me Too, which is because I'm a woman, you must believe me.
Yes, you're a victim.
I'm a victim. Why would I lie? And of course, they didn't. People did believe me, but they didn't think I should say it. I shouldn't say these things because my interpretation is wrong.
Yes.
And actually, I may well be able to reinterpret what I said along the lines of Me Too. But I don't think they should believe me. Why should they just take my word for this? I've no doubt that my memories are not accurate. And I've no doubt I've excluded loads of other examples that would not fit the narrative I chose to take. So I think that all of those examples tell us nothing about men or masculinity, which is what Me Too would say they do. Most of the men, apart from the women, were breaking already agreed rules.
Yes.
You don't ask a young woman who's 20 years younger than you to remove her jumper and pay her money. I mean, who thinks that's normal moral behaviour? Nobody thinks that's acceptable. He didn't think it was acceptable, which is why he was really ashamed of what he did. So they're already breaking rules that we've already established, and some of them are illegal and some of them are not. They're just social codes.
But according to Me Too, they're all illegal.
They should all be illegal. Yes, and probably they should all be made illegal, possibly, but certainly they should all be acted upon in one way, which is to report to the world, to expose and report. I don't think they necessarily think the police will get involved in all of these things unless they're extremely naive as to what the police have time to do. But the other thing that I was trying to challenge was the Me Too version, which is that we're not victims, we're survivors. They say, well, we're victims, but also we're not victims. We're survivors. And I think in those scenarios, the only scenario where I was actually really under threat was with the 15 girls. Because if I had taken a different course of action, I think I probably could have been quite seriously injured. But I don't think I survived that. It didn't happen. The violence didn't happen. But what they're saying, what Me Too says, is that we are brave, and you should celebrate the fact that I'm speaking about something that happened to me. And I'm not a feminist, actually. But when I was, I would never have thought that feminism was about just being celebrated for something that happened to you. It was about having the freedom to exercise your freedom to act in the world. And I think what the Me Too agenda does is to say to women, the world is not the place for you.
Yeah, you have no agency.
Public space is too risky for you. It's not changed enough yet. So, really think twice. And although what it sounds like what they're saying is, that public space needs to be transformed along the lines, actually, of the kind of restrictions that are already applied in workplaces and on college campuses. They want everywhere to be governed by those kinds of rules.
I know, it's so strange, because for me, feminism was, strong, independent, self-sufficient.
Yeah. Well, what they would say now is that's all very well for you. Well, not you, me.
Yes.
That's all very well for me. I'm just that kind of woman. Well, I wasn't just that kind of woman. I made a decision. And a book that was really influential to me when I was a student was a book by Katie Royfey, the American writer, called The Morning After. And she spotted way back then that there was a real problem on the university campuses in America with the Reclaim the Night marches and a kind of a huge increase in the idea of date rape. And what she spotted was that compared to her mother's generation of feminists, there was this new version of womanhood that was coming to the fore, which was this idea that we are just victims, that rape is everywhere, that as a woman you're really more likely to be raped than find a husband, these kind of stats that came out from American feminism. And that had a huge impact on me. And I really thought I didn't like the way that feminism was going in the late 80s, 1990s. So on campus, the main activity of the Women's Committee was to hand out rape alarms on a very, very safe university campus. That's all they did, really, and then talk about tampons, I think, the rest of the time, about not being biodegradable. It was utterly depressing. And not that I was particularly drawn towards feminist politics, but...
They are biodegradable. They just don't have a long enough time span.
It's not something I've ever spent any time thinking about, but obviously you have.
I have.
But it had no appeal as anything, politically engaging. And in fact, the critique of what feminism had become was something I was much more interested in than anything else. And since then, I've never said that I am a feminist, because to me... The
morning after, the title, it refers to how you feel the morning after you've had random sex.
Yes, so it's about the kind of reinterpretation of your experience once you experience a degree of regret. And with the feminist sort of mantra of men are always in control, if the woman regrets a sexual encounter, the only explanation for that feeling of regret is that she must have been forced to do the thing she did the night before.
But that's horrible.
Well, it's there. That is the idea at the moment, isn't it? That's the idea behind.
That means you can do
training.
whatever you want, and you can always blame someone else for your actions.
Well, there was some really interesting examples that came up from the audience today. Eventually, so initially, the audience was much more against me and on the side of Me Too. But actually, as it progressed, you could feel that the space opened up for there to be some kind of. But maybe men were empowered in the audience to speak. Empowerment was the word of the session. But so one man said, "Well, a woman finished a relationship with me, and she then accused me of all kinds of terrible behaviour, and I had to go through hell to prove my innocence." And another young man spoke towards the end, which was a fantastic contribution, which really again raised lots of other questions. Where he said that when he was 12. He was accused by an aunt of sexually touching his cousin, which he didn't do. But it created a huge schism in the family. And actually, I think if that was in the UK, there would have been social services and possibly police involvement. In America, there would be even more serious consequences. There's some horrendous
there would have
happening.
To be a wedding, at least in Alabama.
No, he would be in prison.
Yes.
So Lenora Skenazy writes about this, who writes blogs as Free Range Parenting.
Would a child go to prison for that in the United States?
So I saw her speak recently at the Battle of Ideas in London, and one of the examples she gave was exactly this scenario, where a boy, it wasn't a false accusation, he did actually touch his sister's genitals, but I think he was 11 at the time, and the sister was 7 or 8. And he is still in his 20s. He's still subject to. He had to go to a young offenders institution. He's on the sex offenders register, and even though he's reconciled with his sister, he's not allowed to be in the presence of any child. And he's been put back into prison consistently because he has breached certain conditions, like, for example, going to dinner at his family, and then a teenager turns up who actually turns out to be under 17, where nobody knew that they were. So this is where we end up. We can end up in these kinds of places, and actually we're already there. So Me Too is not the cause of this. No. Me Too is part of a much longer process. It's a symptom, but it also does accelerate things, I think. And but the other thing that's come through, and it's come through throughout the discussion today, is this idea that you can't say that. So my version, my interpretation of my events was really said to be illegitimate. So somebody said,
someone on the panel?
Someone on the panel. So Sissy said that, well, she basically said I was a witch, I think, that my views are really completely unacceptable, and women like me were depressing, because we don't believe, and we say that you should just man up or just kind of handle yourself differently because that's what I can do. And that really isn't what I'm saying. I'm not saying that all women can always take control of situations, but I'm saying that you have to aspire to that and actually give yourself some options. And then Marta said that, well, that's because I'm from the UK, and like she knows people in Poland, and Poland and the UK are way behind Sweden. And we're kind of these backwaters where these kind of ridiculous views like mine are still able to be aired and heard. But in Sweden, that's not the case. So the implication being that I just shouldn't say what I'm saying.
That's why we flew you in.
Yeah. And so it's, you can see the closing down, and with a real fervour of any possibility of having a rational discussion, and to try to say, well, actually, I do agree that sexual violence is a problem, but what the hell do we do about it? Which things can we do something about, and which things, if we try to involve the law in solving them, we actually make things intolerable because we just take away the freedom that women fought for. So it's a difficult discussion to have, I think, and but the good thing about Me Too has not come from Me Too. It's the fact that there has been a relatively it's been possible to challenge it in the UK, I think, although people in Sweden have said that there has been no critical voices so far. Whereas actually in the UK, there have been quite a few, usually older women, who have said, look, really, it's not a big deal to have your knee touched. And sometimes it's quite nice. But the line between when it's nice and when it's not nice is really one to be negotiated between the two people. It's not something that can be decided in advance.
Two grown-ups, yeah.
Two grown-ups. And this theme of infantilization has occurred throughout the whole discussion. But there's a sort of tendency to cast those older women as knowing nothing, as if they know nothing about the today's world or today's women, and that the view is either that those women were, I've got a sort of false consciousness that they were just unable to spot oppression when they experienced it, or that they were complicit, and that they used the fact of their kind of sexual power to do down other women and to turn a blind eye to what was happening to other women.
I think the term you're looking for is patriarchal pleaser, PP for short.
Right. Well, I've not heard that one, but that's probably what they would say. But this also turns into a kind of generation war. So all old men are awful abusers who have no idea of what they're doing. They're just bumbling around, touching women at random. And all old women are these idiots who couldn't even see what was happening when it was in plain sight. And the rejection of experience, of life experience, of women who've experienced all kinds of stuff and actually had to deal with it and learnt lessons about how you deal with it, is just completely ignored. And the continual refrain is we shouldn't have to deal with this stuff, which is a very strange idea because it's a sort of utopian idea that somehow you could eliminate all bad stuff from the world, which I find really strange. I don't really understand.
Not only bad stuff, also good stuff. Cissi Wallin was just a week ago. She was on Channel 4 in Sweden in a morning show, kind of like The View in the States. And she said, I have realized now, becoming older, that sometimes men will say nice things to girls in order to manipulate them into sex.
Yeah. Yes.
What we used to refer to as compliments.
Yes. Well, she said compliments, really, you should never say them. She said, why is it so difficult for men to understand that a compliment is not a compliment for a woman? What you think is a compliment really isn't. It's just a comment on their appearance and it's an objectification. I mean, it's the most depressing worldview. I can't believe that. I don't really think these people actually live their lives in this way. I really hope they don't.
I wouldn't call it a life.
Well, it would be a joyless existence, which is why I don't believe that that's what's happening. So when Cissi says that, there is a war against women, if that's the case, how can we all sit in that room today with women sitting next to men in an uncontrolled fashion? How can I sit next to a man on the panel if he's at war with me? It doesn't make any sense, and it is disingenuous, and it is a real distortion of reality. I'm not quite sure why.
Can I show you a map?
Yeah.
So I'm going to show you now a picture, a screenshot of Google Trends. Do you know what that is?
Yes.
It's, you can analyze stuff, right?
Yeah.
So this is a country-by-country map for the Me Too campaign.
Right.
And the country who has the most interest in Me Too, well, it's given the value 100, and everything else is below.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I had a similar...
Could you describe what you're seeing?
Yes, well, Sweden is at 100.
Yes.
And then the Netherlands is below that, and then
at what?
Canada, Denmark.
Yes.
So
the Netherlands has 38.
Well, that absolutely chimes with a study that I found, which was by the EU, which was a study of women and violence and their experience of violence across the whole of the EU. And the worst countries, apparently, are Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, and Luxembourg.
Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And could you please explain to me, because you're smarter than I am and you're a real scientist and a researcher, could you explain to me how the most feminist countries in the world could have the highest level of misogyny?
Yes, because they've changed the definition of what sexual harassment is. So this is why the EU study is so interesting. So when I read it, I was thinking, oh my goodness, you always look at these things and look at these stats and think, oh God, I'm wrong. It must be wrong because there's statistics here. But then you look at the way in which the statistics are created. And so this was a very large study which found that apparently women in Romania experience less sexual harassment than women in Sweden. Ludicrous, obviously. It
is. I've been to Romania.
And, obviously that might be my prejudice against Romania, but I suspect that there's something else going on here. But when you look at what the survey asked about and how they define sexual harassment, they says the question was, which was put to them face to face by a researcher, at times you may have experienced people acting towards you in a way that you felt was unwanted and offensive. How often have you experienced any of the following? How often has this happened to you in the past 12 months? And there's 11 bullet points of offensive behaviour. They say 6 of them are the most serious. These are the most serious. Unwelcome touching, hugging or kissing. Sexually suggestive comments or jokes that made you feel offended. Somebody sending or showing you sexually explicit pictures, photos or gifts that made you feel offended. Somebody indecently exposing themselves to you. Somebody made you watch or look at pornographic material against your wishes. Unwanted sexually explicit emails or SMS messages that offended you. Now, I cannot believe that the rate is only 55%, if this is the criteria. And that was the figure that was the highest point, which was for Sweden, etc.
Well, I think that's actually good news, because that means that almost half the population are normal enough not to actually answer to these stupid surveys.
Well, it is extraordinary. So I go through those. So unwelcome touching, hugging or kissing by people.
Yes.
So that could be my husband
Yes.
on a night that I'm not up for it. That could be my children. It could be me towards my children when I give them a hug and a kiss and they really don't want it.
Which happens.
Yeah.
Everyone who has a mother has experienced it.
Although now we are being told that we mustn't ever force our hugs and kisses on children. They must be taught about boundaries, and you should never make them kiss
I've seen the articles in Swedish, so I guess there are the same recipes prescribed for the English audience.
Yes, the child really shouldn't offer their cheek to the grandmother unless they really want to. This is their facial cheek, not their butt cheek, because that teaches them that they don't have control and that boundaries can be crossed and they must consent. I'm always really interested in it because of my interest in parenting, which is that baby massage classes, which are available to lots of parents in lots of areas, provided for by the state. The first thing that's taught there is that you must ask your baby permission before you touch them. And before you remove their clothing so that you can then touch them in massage.
This is insane. Where did you say this was?
This is just written into the kind of ethos of baby massage, which is it's partly about teaching appropriate touch. I mean, the idea is that it's actually about brain development and making relaxed babies and bonding between the mother and child. But as part of the code and the teaching is this idea that you must teach appropriate boundaries, and asking permission of somebody before you touch them is always, always, always really important.
Yes, but babies don't really...
Well, they can't respond, obviously, and we move them around all the time to put their coats on and their hats on and put them into pushchairs.
They're completely dependent of us.
It's obviously ridiculous. But the second one I thought was interesting, given that there was a comedian on the panel, which sexually suggestive comments or jokes that made you feel offended. This is by any person. This is not in a workplace. This is just anywhere. So if I go to a comedy club and one comedian says, there's 5 comedians and one of them says something that I don't like and it makes me feel offended, then I'm now part of the statistics. I'm the most crude person that I know.
Yes.
I'm very vulgar and I enjoy that kind of humour. So actually, probably it's me that's the perpetrator in most of those scenarios. But similarly, my teenage son likes to try to shock me by telling me outrageous jokes. Yes. And this is the kind of game we play, which is, go on, shock me. Tell me a joke about Hitler. Tell me a joke, anything. Yes. And
I understand.
And that's the
because
point.
I'm a real comedian.
That's the point. And so we're reaching the point. This is just words. It's just words. So we've gone from touching to words. Somebody sending or showing you sexually explicit pictures, photos, or gifts that made you feel offended. I'm trying to think what kind of
dildo.
Well, yeah, fine. I might not want that in my workplace, but I know somebody who works in architecture, and it's not a particularly macho culture where she works, and she's done extremely well as a woman and really doesn't think there's been any barriers to her progress. But at their Christmas party, they have to give each other presents, and one of her gifts a few years ago, I think, was an apron which had stockings and suspenders on it. Which she then wore throughout the Christmas meal.
Okay.
Now, on top of other clothes. Now that under this criteria, she has been harassed. Now she's the boss of these people.
Well, she's only been harassed if she feels.
Feels offended. Okay, yes. Okay.
So if she can take the joke and just go with it, then it's all fine.
But somebody else in the team showing you sexually explicit pictures, photos. So somebody else who sees her wearing the apron can be offended.
Yes.
And they have been harassed. Somebody indecently exposing themselves to you, well, fine, the guy in the bushes, that's reasonable. Somebody made you watch or look at pornographic material against your wishes. Okay, I'm trying to imagine that scenario, but okay, let's go with that one. But the one I think is interesting, unwanted sexually explicit emails or SMS messages that offended you. This is from anywhere. So that includes me getting emails about Viagra, presumably, if I'm of a delicate disposition.
Yes, and also can't handle the block function on your phone.
And it also, certainly everybody I know that's using Tinder or any kind of dating app, this is what tends to happen. You put yourself out there, and before you know it, you've got a cock shot coming into your phone.
And then you use the block function.
Yeah. So what do you then conclude from that? Is that you'd have to say that it's just impossible to be a human being with other human beings. And these are the most serious.
Yes,
according to this. So everybody, I'm really surprised it's only 55%, but I'm not surprised that when.
But do you now, when you've seen the picture and you found that study, do you understand more about the reaction you got from the audience when you?
Oh yeah, I was not surprised by the reaction, but the panelists more than the audience actually, because I think the audience was. As time went on, the audience, some very, very interesting things came through. And
well, the leaders have a very strong interest of you not speaking out here.
Well, it's it's an interesting one because apparently when the debate was organised, some people found it quite hard to think that there would be any negative reaction to Me Too, that there could be any criticism. Why would anybody object to this? And I think I've had lots of conversations with people in the preceding weeks. I've sort of sought out conversations with people of different ages. And everybody agrees, actually, that it is a good thing if women don't have to stay silent because they don't have to feel embarrassed or ashamed that these things happen. It's not their shame. And I think that's right.
Fair.
Okay, fine. But then most people have also said, but I think it's gone too far. And I'm really worried that knee touching, which is the kind of infamous example in the UK of an MP who has alleged to have touched a journalist on the knee, or maybe not. She said it could have been the tablecloth of the table. And he was then, pilloried and exposed. But he's denied it. But it's her word against his. Everybody also agrees that is a ridiculous situation to be in, to have any outrage about. And I think that what's interesting as well about Sweden is that one of the people accused is a woman.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that hasn't come out here yet.
But she's not been named. But it is the fact that people know that she is a woman. Don't they?
Well, some people know that she's a woman if they have, online skills.
Well, I read about it on the internet that that one of the accusations is against a woman.
Yes, well, patriarchy can take any shape or form.
Well, but that's this is what's interesting is who gets scooped up because it is just sexual puritanism, isn't it?
Yes.
So on somebody raised the question from the audience about what I thought about the dodgy dossier, which was this spreadsheet that was being passed amongst parliamentary researchers, which exposed supposedly, aberrant sexual behaviour by members of parliament. And some people on the list were women. One of them was a woman who's very high up in the Conservative Party who was having a relationship. She was single. She was having a relationship with another single member of parliament. And this was on the list.
Yes. Very inappropriate.
Gay men.
Yes.
And when we look at Kevin Spacey and, you can see the kind of... suddenly there's no resistance to this kind of
well in
horror.
Sweden we have a recipe for disaster because this has been a social democratic country for a very long time and it's ingrained in socialism that it's not your fault. There's always socioeconomic factors or something else to blame, the structure, the system. So away with personal responsibility, and then when third wave feminism comes in and says you're always a victim, then you have a recipe for true disaster, especially when the state decides to teach this from kindergarten and upwards and make classes in gender science, not studies, science, mandatory in every university course. Regardless of what you read, you have to have a gender perspective on things. So what they have created here is a situation where we have a sect that encompasses maybe 25-30% of the country, mostly in the young generations, and how to deprogram them, I don't know.
Well, I think the only thing you can do is really continue to create spaces for the other versions to come through, which is what I was trying to do today, was to give the alternative version. And because what they say is, well, we don't need to bother about that. We've already moved on. we've moved on and you're just left behind. You're the dinosaurs, which is what's been said about men and about these older women who say, look, we handled this at the time. It was okay. It wasn't okay, but I could deal with it. It wasn't destroying of my very being. None of them are saying it was okay for a guy to grab my breasts when I'm trying to write a newspaper article. None of them said it's okay for a guy to keep pestering me for dates and then threaten my job when I don't accept. None of them said it was okay to do that or that it was appropriate. What they said was that I dealt with it.
Yes.
And then what this undoes is any sense that that the individual can deal with it, but also that the individual can join together with other individuals and do something about it. Because I think that's the only solution really, is you have to be able to talk to other men and women and assume that they will agree with you and they won't condone this guy. And people won't. Nobody's going to say, oh, yeah, I think it was really great that woman got raped and murdered. I mean, who's ever said that? I mean, apart from somebody on Twitter who's probably just trying to shock. But this idea of a sort of pernicious, well, not even pernicious, absolutely ostentatious rape culture, which is the idea that's been put out there, and people just talk about now. Students of mine will talk about rape culture, misogyny, patriarchy. They didn't used to talk in those terms. They would blame everything on the media.
Yes.
And now they blame patriarchy or misogyny or rape culture. And I don't think they've really thought about it enough to really hold it that dear. So I think it can be overturned relatively easily, actually, which is why it's worth challenging whenever you possibly can. But,
you think so?
Yeah.
Even here in Sweden?
Well, I don't know enough about Sweden, but I certainly think in the UK it's, yes, there are the zealots, and you won't change their minds, but you have to always assume there's an audience, and that by challenging the zealot, you then give license to other people to actually make their own challenges, even if it's just in their own heads. Yes. And I think you have to continually question and to engage, and to not give up on that. That they somehow accept their view that we've already gone that far, because we haven't. It's an open question, actually. I think it's. I think in the UK there's a lot of discussion now about, well, do we really want wolf whistling to be seen as a crime, which is what's happening in one English city.
What do you mean, wolf whistling? Like whistling after women in the street? Okay, so that they want to make that into a crime.
It has been made into it
is a crime, but not on a national level. It's like some municipal.
Yeah.
All right.
And whereas I've spoken to lots of women over the last couple of weeks who've said, I actually quite like it. And you speak to anyone in my age, nearly 50, and people sort of say, oh, it doesn't happen anymore. And actually, I go running 3 times a week with a friend of mine, and sometimes we get a beep on a horn. And, the ritual is you then raise your middle finger at the guy, and that's it. That's the kind of ritual. It's it's not because we're horrified by it. We just raise our middle finger and sort of go, what? And then we secretly go, yeah, that's great. There's not one up.
Still got it.
We still got it. Well, she's younger than me, so I think it's probably her, not me. But it's that. But the ritual is to raise your middle finger. That's what you do. You don't assume he's going to come and rape you. You just think he's a jerk. Why would you do that? But okay, he did it, so I do this, and that's my response. And then you run on. You don't kind of go on Me Too on Twitter and say, this guy beeped his horn, it's part of everyday sexism, it's all men are terrible. Because what I didn't say was at the very, very opening remarks in the debate was that men are creeps. This is what I think it was. I can't remember whether it was the comedian. I think it was the comedian, Jonathan Rollins, his opening remarks was, well, we all know men are creeps. Well, no.
Oh, from time to time, but not all the time.
Well, no, not even, no.
That depends on how you define
What does it mean,
creep?
a creep? I mean, what does a creep mean?
Well, sometimes I have dirty thoughts, and sometimes...
so do I.
Yes.
I'm not a creep. I'm just a human being, with a range of thoughts in my head. So the idea that somehow... that just having sexual thoughts is dirty. I mean, this is what's being said here. It's dirty, isn't it? And it must be driven out. It's just, intolerable. This horrible human thing of sexuality. It's just a dreadful thing, and it's alien to women, and it should be alien to men, or at least we need to somehow rigidly control it.
I think so.
Yeah.
So let's see, we've talked for 55 minutes. Okay. I want to thank you, Jan, for taking your time.
Thank you very much.
And I hope I can interview you again if the need arises.
Yeah, well, I'll take that into consideration. I'll weigh it up, and I'll have to reassess your behaviour first.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Jan Macvarish on Deconstructive Criticism. Links to all of Jan Macvarish's tips, articles and books can be found in the description below the episode on Patreon. A link to Patreon can be found on whatever app you're using. Now, sex is the driving force and the most dangerous drive in human nature. Almost everything we do is subconsciously done for procreation. Basically, we're all horny animals. It is not pretty. We want it to be pretty, which is why we invented romance, to make it look pretty, but it's not. Before Freud, human sexuality was frowned upon. Both male and female had to hide their sexual urges, deny that they were sexual beings, which wasn't very healthy either and not much fun. Freud's theories helped, for a lack of better words, to liberalize sex, from being shameful and base to something to be enjoyed and celebrated. Hooray! No longer was it the priests or your family that decided who you should have sex with, but you got to decide for yourself. Now, the only way this could work was that everyone saw themselves as an individual and took personal responsibility for their actions. Not that it really matters. Every advancement, every attempt at friendship or love, in every culture, in every time, is always a sort of negotiation. I like you, do you like me? Can I give you something? Can I touch you there? Can I put this fist here? You know. Never more so than in the Western world from Freud and on. Ever since the sexual liberation, it is incumbent on every individual, regardless of gender or sexuality, to take responsibility for their own actions and to listen and to apologize if necessary. And if you really love someone, it will probably become necessary as you get to know each other better. The thing is, it is a huge gray area. Some things you thought you'd like, you won't. And some things you thought you'd hate, you might end up craving the most. Like molded cheese. But if you make mistakes, take it with the person you wronged, if it's not too serious. It is only children who always need grown-ups to intervene, and grown-ups who wants the state to intervene in their sex lives, well, let's just say I will reserve my judgment. The hippie cry from 1968 for free sex was something else. That was not free sex. They wanted to free sex from responsibility, which was doomed to failure. As I told you, the human sex drive is a dangerous animal. It has to be well trained or kept on a leash. What MeToo and the new definitions of what constitutes sexual harassment does is a direct attack on free sexuality, or like one of my female friends called it, life. It's an attack on life. Because that's what that gray area is. The things that aren't black or white, where disappointment and hurt and shame lies, but also excitement, creativity and novelty. I have been watching this movement since I first encountered it in my early 20s. It made me wary because of its clear totalitarian ideology. I have reported on it and studied it as part of my profession. And they all believe in this triangle, like most conspiracy theorists, where everything is connected. At the bottom of the triangle is inappropriate jokes, sexist slurs, unconscious but norm-reinforcing behavior. And at the top is rape and murder. It's all part of the same structure, so if I laugh at a rape joke in Stockholm, then Cassandra gets raped in Syria by some sort of if a butterfly flutters its wings in China, there's a hurricane in Brazil type logic. Just in this campaign, I've seen one of the movement's leaders say on national TV that it's important that we view an unwelcome text message or joke as the same as rape because it creates the same feeling in what she calls the victim, which is relativizing rape like hell. And she got to do it without the host asking a single critical question on state television funded by citizens. And like all extreme and or utopian movements, I'm not surprised that it has turned out like this. When we talk about extremists of other sorts, like white supremacists, we know that we need a defection program in place. And when we talk about racists or Islamists, we always say that what they aim to do with this attack or that attack is to erase the gray area, the area where people of different faiths and colors can coexist. But we never talk like that about radical feminists. We should. It's equally true for them. They want to eliminate the gray area where the sexes can meet and coexist. Just as we talk about white supremacists or black supremacists, we should talk about female supremacists. Because that's what they are. Extremists. Or in this case, sextremists. After applying gender science on school children for nearly 30 years, all we have to show for it is the second highest grade gap between genders in the world. Finland beats us again, but apart from that, we're like number 2, right? So, and we have 12% of boys are diagnosed with ADHD, 6% of the girls. Suicide is at an all-time high. Gender science, a political ideology masquerading as science, telling women that they are all powerless, fragile, childlike, victims, and all men are rapists, at the same time that it states that there are no biological difference between the sexes at all. Under the auspice of gender science, academic freedom is suspended, and friends and government agencies have been given orders to report sexual harassment. What I mean by that is that the departments have to find people to report. Otherwise, they run the risk of being accused of not dealing with the problem. What is happening is creating an environment where you have to find proof of sexual harassment, otherwise you are part of the problem. If you can't find a witch, then you are the witch. My personal favorite recorded mass hysteria was the laughter epidemic of Tanganyika. It happened in 1962 in what is today Tanzania. It broke out in the village of Kashasha. In a girls' school. No comparison to what's going on in Sweden today, apart from that. It spreads from a few of the girls until everyone was affected and started laughing uncontrollably. The school had to close, but when the children were sent home, the laugh epidemic spread through the village and to villages nearby. The patients had laughing fits that could last from everything from 2 hours up to 16 days. The epidemic came and went for almost 9 months before disappearing forever. Tanzania had just won its independence, and it was later attributed to stress. But that mass hysteria was more of a laughing matter. A closer comparison to what is going on in Sweden would be the Chinese Cultural Revolution, where everyone was forced to gather in huge gymnasiums and write confessions of their anti-communist thoughts and feelings and report suspicions on their friends, family, and co-workers. That too was done to build a socialist utopia. We just have to get rid of the bad people, and it will come, they hoped. Unfortunately, it didn't create a safe, loving space. Quite the contrary, it tore the social fabric apart. It fostered suspicion, paranoia, and hate. Which sounds a lot more like what Sweden is going through at the moment. There is a syndrome called Munchausen syndrome. You might have heard of a variation of it called Munchausen by proxy. That's where usually a woman hurts her children and or her pets to get sympathy for herself. Well, Munchausen is when you give yourself an affliction. You don't have it for real, you just do it to get attention. Now let's say your state ideology is basically built on victimhood. What type of environment do you think that would foster? That is why I suggest that Sweden at the moment is in the throes of a Munchausen mass hysteria. Gad Saad may have coined the term, but I'm calling it. For a long time, we Swedes have been ignoring real problems and focusing on the patriarchy, to the extent that we now see rapists everywhere. In the end, it not only empties the word rape and sexual harassment of meaning, it is also really shitty to people who have really been raped and really been sexually assaulted. And if you then add that it destroys the justice system, creates an informer society of paranoia and mistrust, and destroys innocent lives, some for small stuff like jokes and some maybe because they had bothered the wrong person who then decided to lie anonymously about them. I also heard another leading feminist claim that the Me Too phenomenon shouldn't be politicized, but it is obvious that this has political dimensions. The left has dominated the official narrative in Sweden for a long time. A lot of those narratives are now being confronted with reality. Power, according to Alinsky, is only interested in two things: keeping power or expanding its power. As long as it manages to do that, everything is fine, but as soon as the power shrinks, the different factions and individuals will start attacking each other. What will happen is usually the weakest link will start to attack the second weakest link, and so on and so forth until it consumes itself entirely or a new equilibrium is found. That is why this predominantly is hitting the left so far. They are the ones who believes in gender science the most. They are also the ones who has forced it on everybody else and named names of politicians and leaders on the right that didn't live up to their standard of what a feminist man should be. Now their own are being hung out by themselves. At first egged on by the right because everyone was happy about the hypocrisy finally coming to an end, but by now I guess we all just stand back in horrid fascination with this ideological purgatory. But even if, when all is said and done and the unions have gone through every business sector they have a presence in, it is still not good that a small percentage of the population who participate, fooled as they are by their leaders and or their ideology, is gathering sexual blackmail information on themselves and everybody else in the country. Just like the Scientologists make you confess your secrets to keep you in the sect, or East Germany not too long ago. It could also explain why 70% of female lawyers didn't sign the petition. It's not that they are for rape and sexual harassment. No sane person is. It's probably because they can read or because they've been around the block before, so to speak, and know that empty gestures of goodness never lead to anything good. And probably quite a few signed because it is a good cause. I mean, which sane person isn't against rape and sexual harassment, as I said? It's a sign of good intentions that you think will cost you nothing, and maybe some will sign it and lie, and some will have real Munchausen syndrome, and some might have feel pressured to sign. It is performative goodness, virtue signaling, and you might think it will cost you nothing, but heaven is not right around the corner, just more blood. And all it achieves is forming an informer society, relativizing rape. That's what's going on here. They're conflating unwanted behavior with rape and sexual harassment, calling everybody a rapist until real rapists are just regular people. There are only 2 exceptions to freedom of speech in a civilized country, and I'm not claiming to live in one myself. Google Trends would prove me wrong. The first is when you use speech to incite violence. And calling someone a rapist is inciting violence. The other exception to freedom of speech is libel. Calling someone a rapist when they are not, or claiming that all men are party to rape just by being born in a male body, is libel. The Tanganyika laughter epidemic was later partly explained by the shared sense of losing control that becoming the sovereign nation of Tanzania meant. And maybe that can explain why white middle-class women from our elites, the most privileged group of people to ever have lived, are leading this charge right now. Sweden has, after all, had a real rape epidemic for a few years now. And women in the suburbs have been complaining of moral police roaming the streets to make sure they cover up and behave like proper Muslim women. At the same time, our leaders are calling out Me Too. Me Too. They are losing control. And maybe this is a Munchausen by proxy, mass hysteria. But in that case, we, the populace, are the proxy. This will not work. The way to improve society and ourselves is to take on personal responsibility. That means speaking out when we see something wrong, not on a message board years later anonymously, but right then and there. And like I said in the interview with Jan, I can never sign off on a feminism that doesn't tell people that they are strong, independent, and capable of taking personal responsibility for their actions. It might not be true, or it might be very hard to accomplish, but it's the only hope we have. Links to this and everything else we mentioned in the conversation can and always will be found in the description below this episode on Patreon. If you live in Sweden and want to swish me and support Deconstructive Criticism, just swish me at number 0768943737 0768943737 0768943737. And if you want to donate some bitcoins, there will be a link under the episode on Patreon. Until next time, have a good time, unit.